Hello again, everybody, and my name is John D Healy. I do a podcast. It's called It's Good to Talk, and it sure is good to talk. My sponsors are Liffey Van Lines, moving company here in New York City, and they've been in business longer than the New York City Marathon, over 50 years, running very smooth, with 148 countries taking part. I did a podcast last week. Adam Cardone explained how to prepare for a marathon, what you should do before and what you should do after in case you get all your joints and knees and all buckled up. My other shout out is for the Irish Glamour USA, here at paper here in New York that gives a lot of events, music especially, and we'll be going back into music in a minute, and that is Paddy McCarthy. And people did hear me say last week that Paddy McCarthy was going to get me 2 tickets for Oasis. Well, yes, Paddy did get me 2 tickets for Oasis. But thank all of you people that want to get me more tickets for Oasis. So please don't do that. If you have tickets, spare tickets, give them to your friends. Please don't send them to me. That's like looking for tickets for the All-Ireland football final and you already have 2 tickets in your pocket. So don't do that. But I do thank you, and especially friends in Cork and all over. I'll mention a few of them later on too. Now, I have one other event to shout out for, and this is from the Mayo Society of New York. I just put up like that. And this is a golf outing on the 3rd of October, organised by the Mayo Society of New York. It's for a young woman from Illinois, actually, where I'm from, or born, and she's raising funds for medical expenses. She has almost hit the target. Very expensive operation and very expensive post-treatment. Mags Dean Smith is from Illinois. So thanks to the Mayo Society of New York, I'll put up the flyer, and it's a great deal. You just play golf and hang around, have food and drinks, and hopefully no one hurts you. Now, I always have an interesting guest on. My guest today has been on before with me a few times, actually. We did talk about the Good Friday Agreement, and we compared it to an agreement that was made by the man himself, known as the Longfellow. And that was a very good discussion, and we solved a lot there. Of course, at the time, I'm still promoting the 2030 United Ireland. But today I want to go back to Brian Leyden. Brian is a writer, author, and historian. I've read all of his books, I think, well, if I can catch up with him. The Home Place, Summer of '63, and The Sweet Old World, which turned out to be a nice book. A lot of people got it from me, and they enjoyed it because it's like short stories and interesting and enjoyable. And today we're going to probably do something the same. Brian is going to take me on a trip. So I'm going to say hello to Brian.
Hello, John.
Yeah, good to have you back. It's always interesting. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, always, of course. Now, today you're talking about you're bringing me on like a road trip, I guess it's called, because I promoted a book last week, which was a road trip. So tell me about this road trip. It's a road trip in stories and music.
Yes,
So
that's right, John. It was on my mind because I've just recently completed touring a show where it's a spoken word and live music show that toured around various theatres in Ireland. And we called it Old Flames. It was my writings and me on stage, along with a musician who's probably very well known also in trad music session circles in America as Sligo, and that's Seamie O'Dowd, son of Joe O'Dowd, great Sligo fiddle player. Seamie's a multi-instrumentalist. He can do everything he can channel the spirit of his father from Michael Coleman, Joe Dowd music, right up to Rory Gallagher and up to the new stuff, even your Oasis. He can pretty much do anything. So what we did was we toured a show called Old Flames, and Old Flames tells the story of Ireland really through my family, grandparents, parents and myself, and through music and through the tunes and songs and dance halls and house dances and all that, where we sort of evolved as a nation and grew up together. And what got me interested in our chat, John, is that there is a part of that which is very much about our relationship in the west of Ireland, in particular with America, and often with the cities of New York and Chicago, which tended to be the natural sort of landing places for the immigrant Irish in America. So I thought today we'd share and swap some memories that were triggered by the show, and let's just see where our road trip takes us.
Well, my family and lots of families from Mayo and Erris and Balmullet and all that area, you know, they left back in, I suppose, the 20s and 30s. And one generation helped the next generation. And it's still ongoing, actually, to the day. You know, aunts and uncles, previous aunts and uncles and previous people that arrived, and even cousins and second cousins would help people arriving here find accommodation. Very important. As soon as you get here, you have to have a place to put your head down. It might be just a sofa, but you're not out in Central Park unless it's summertime. And then the next thing they had to get you was a job. So they were the two essentials.
Yes.
Place to stay and get a job. I think it was when I arrived here, I was only 16 myself. And my older brother, Kevin, at the time, gave me a job as a doorman and an elevator operator. I had never seen an elevator in my life because we're pretty much on level land in Mayo. So I enjoyed it. I had a uniform, not too much unlike what I'm wearing, with my name on it here, which I was very proud of. I thought it was a big, big step up from Glenamoy. And I operated an elevator with the old handle thing, and people would meet me and say, "What's the job like?" And I'd always have a smart comment, say, "Well, it has its ups and downs. It's an elevator." So let me hear more of your stories, Brian.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you tie in very well with the Irish writer Brendan Behan. He met an uncle in New York as well and saw the big skyscraper and was asked, what floor does he work on? He said he works on all the floors, so he must be very important, he thought. But like that, he was an elevator man, which is a job, of course, that passed and has been superseded by technology. Not so in the case of my grandmother. My grandmother, like your earlier relations, John, would have come to Ireland via maybe a White Star liner and through Ellis Island. Certain economic class, their passports and their visas and their documentation were checked on board ship, and that was fine. But if you were in steerage, and many Irish were, then you were processed in Ellis Island. And Ellis Island, I mean, at that stage, it was still relatively straightforward, but even then, it had what was known as the kissing gate, where relatives hugged and met with successfully through, and the gate of tears, where if there was something wrong with you, chalk X was drawn on your back and you were returned because you had health issues. So it was a slightly nervous and fearful place. And I remember my grandmother had come through Ellis Island, and in thanks, almost the first thing she did was splash out and got the price of going to church, to Mass, to have Mass said. And she was taken actually to the enormous, gigantic St. Patrick's Cathedral. She said, looking nervously at this, she said, "Are you sure I'll get Mass here?" And it's alleged the taxi driver said, "Well, if God ain't here, he ain't nowhere in town."
I like that.
So there was, of course, that community of Irish in place, which my grandmother joined. And lately I came across a term which I'd forgotten about, and maybe people listening to us will remember it. She got a job as a maid, and there were some very big wealthy families, especially along Fifth Avenue and that. And the Irish maids were known as the Bridgets. Bridgets, because the Bridget was such a common name. And the Bridgets were a very sought after group of people because they educated in the sense that they grew up on farms, knew how to manage a household, could bake, clean, launder, and they spoke English. So the Bridgets became a very, very popular pool for this wealthy class of people to draw their labours from. And that's where my grandmother got her start in America amongst the Bridgets.
I'll go back to one word you mentioned earlier on there for the sake of my listeners. When you said on the ships coming over that those that couldn't afford the upper echelon had to go in steerage.
Yeah.
The steerage being, I think, the lower deck below
the lower decks, basically. Yes.
And it was kind of rough and ready economy class, I guess we call it.
It was, though fans of the film Titanic will think that maybe they have all the various strata on the ship, you know? And indeed, if you ever get a chance, or any of our listeners ever get a chance to visit Belfast and the Titanic Centre, they can see an elevator that sort of projects and takes you through all the floors to come back to our theme, and you get all the sense. And Titanic made it out that it was the best fun with Leonardo DiCaprio and the Irish music below deck. Yeah.
I totally agree. I've been on a few cruise ships myself, and I was brought to steerage for a social drink with some friends that worked on the cruise, because that's where that's their accommodation. But I won't dwell on that because then it might get too personal for me.
So my grandmother arrives in America and works as a maid, and that's okay. But I mean, she has an employer, and they were severe because she went around with a white glove, and she would run the white glove on the stair banister and sometimes under pieces of furniture. And if it got soiled and dirtied and dusted, it meant the maid wasn't doing her job. So there was very tight surveillance and control. So she actually ended up working with some aunts and uncles of mine, the Doonans, on East 23rd Street in what seemingly was an ice cream parlour, but this was the 1920s and you had prohibition in place. And this was a front for bootleg gin. food in the bathtub. So actually, she would carry these sweet cans full of, and she'd be warned to put a lid on it not to spill her message. And that obtained pretty well. Although we had an aunt, these Doonans actually arrived in Ireland eventually, and one of the ladies had no hair but had a wig. And as children, we were fascinated by this because we'd never seen this. Now, I think she had alopecia, and she probably lost her hair with alopecia. But it was rumoured that a bathtub still had exploded, and with the shock, she'd lost her hair. So that was the kind of colourful milieu she ended up in. And she actually then used her time in America, which was unusual in some ways because many went and stayed, to put a war chest together of money and to get a dowry to come home and get married. And she arrived back with one of those great big steamer trunks full of dresses and her dowry, so she'd be able to get married. And indeed the price to buy some extra land around the place as well. That began for us, I think, this very close over and back between the west of Ireland and the home my grandmother established with my grandfather Henry Joe. She was Mary Early, he was Henry Joe McDermott. And it would become the settled home place for Americans who would return, like Granny's sisters, the bootleggers who were there before.
Well, a lot of that kind of still goes on, not as much as often, but when people approach me about moving back to Ireland, and of course, Liffey Van Lines, we do shipping overseas, and I meet the people, and I kind of get to know them. And then I always tell them from experience, oh, you're going back to Ireland to live and to retire and that. And they say, yeah, we are. And they're shipping back big fancy American furniture that they have in their homes here. And when they get back to Ireland, to the bungalow that they've just recently built or bought, the furniture looks out of place. It doesn't fit in. No. And then in a strange way, maybe they don't fit in because things have changed. Yes. And I always say to them, you will be back again.
Yeah.
My other expression for people that move, even leaving New York, going to Texas, I say, when you leave New York City, you're going fucking nowhere. You'll be back again. You're going to return. And after a year or two, they return. They miss New York City. They miss the social life, the work, the interaction, and everything New York has to offer and more.
So, yes, that's interesting, John, because what happens, I think, is, say my grandmother, having made a success enough to get a foothold in Ireland, sent her children as they grew up to America. And the idea was that they would do the same and come back, but they didn't. My aunts and uncles got a foothold there, and they were not for returning. But what they did do was come home with, say, on trips across the Atlantic, first on the ships. And one of the things they would have found like that, as you say, is that, you see, everybody, when the Americans landed home, we were on holiday with them. We downed tools and it was a lovely time. But of course, we were just parking our workaday lives for such time as they were, as we said, home on holiday.
Home on holiday.
That dropped, and you see, when Americans or any other immigrant returned to Ireland thinking that this level of partying and fun and crack would be going on, of course it wasn't, because people had to get on with their lives and their living, and nobody called and nobody visited, and you found that your original neighbours were gone. But I suppose, go ahead.
My mother was very creative when it came to that type of thing, where the American cousins, and English cousins too, would show up in July and August and that.
Yeah.
Her idea to fit them in for a great holiday was to put them out on the farm working with us, making hay, making turf. And they really loved the excitement of it. And then in the evening, we had food and drinks and everything. So she was smart, because it was like, if they have free accommodation...
She was more practical than... My fondest memories are of those Americans. Remember what happened there for a whole generation when I'm coming into the picture in the early 1960s. John F. Kennedy had been elected to the White House. This tanned, fit, handsome, healthy young man of Irish descent, the first, just nearly second, third generation Irish becoming president of America. And he travelled to Ireland in that historic and famous visit. And that lit a flame in the hearts of so many American Irish who wanted to come back. And the charter flights were chock-a-block coming into Shannon Airport of the Americans returning. And I have the fondest memory of them arriving with the duty-free, and they'd have the cigarettes and the whiskey, and there would be a party every night. Neighbours came in to play the accordion. And this, to me, was, I suppose, in a way, to make our cousins feel at home. There was boxes of cornflakes bought. There was treats on the table that would never be out there. There was a roast leg of lamb got because the Americans were home for Sunday dinner. And you see, us children, we were warned not to go asking for second portions of the leg of lamb. So my mother would carve the lamb for the American visitors, and then she turned to us and say, "Anybody for more meat?" And we'd be there, "No thanks, mammy. No thanks, mammy." You know. But we still got, cases of Coca-Cola, the likes of which we'd never tasted, and spaghetti, and spaghetti bolognese, which were new and exotic flavors, and were kind of training us into the American palate and all of that, and I suppose deepened our love for America while the Americans were getting their shot of Ireland.
Well, a lot of households too, Brian, had the blue willow china on the dresser. Blue willow cups and saucer and plates was never taken down, except when the Americans arrived. And it was just a fancy cup, not more a cup, obviously, china. But it was expensive. If you had blue willow, you were on a higher class.
That's right.
Taken down. And whoever was washing the dishes and the cups had to make sure they didn't chip a blue willow or you were in trouble.
Oh, you were in trouble. Yeah, well, remember this, and this always intrigued me, John, that the people who came to our house were my aunts and uncles. They were mainly my mother's family, her sisters and brother, and the husbands and the cousins and all of that. Now, they were immediate family. They had gone to America, and in the photographs that came back from America, they were under big Christmas trees with baubles on them, and they were out on Long Island, and they projected an air of prosperity. And they were more prosperous than we were. But they were Irish. I mean, they were Irish settled in America. And yet, the minute the hired car showed up at our farm gate at the end of the lane, we'd run into the house and shout, "The Yanks are landed." We wanted them to be Yanks. They couldn't be just like us plain people at home. We needed them to be a bit more exotic, better heeled, well off, and all of that. Now, that meant, though, that at some time, first thing that happened, of course, they took over the bathroom. And we never had enough hot water, because we had the stove, the range was lit, revved up, and the fire put on. And, of course, they go into the bathroom, and there'd be 2 hours in there, and my mother out of her mind, wondering would the boiling and would the plumbing hold up at all while all of this. And the bathroom was full of cosmetics. And I remember I seen my first aid Band-Aid. And I really wanted a little cut so I could put it on, and there was medications for stomachs, and my mother had a bit of glycerine she used on her hands and a bit of the Pond's cold cream, and there was all these fancy cosmetics would come in, and this was very exotic. But 9 houses out of 10 that I know of that remember this generation and this time will say that one thing the Americans were very determined to do for the people at home was to get them a fridge.
Yeah.
There was always a fridge bought. And this was because there used to be, which people could hardly fathom, what they called a meat safe. It was like a green metal box with ventilation holes in it. And that kept sort of the meat fresh, safe from flies and things, but it didn't keep it cool. There might be a bit of something to keep it cool in a cool spot. So the idea of the fridge coming was a big thing, and that it would make a little compartment to have ice in it.
Now that we were getting to that, the second thing with the Yanks, as you call them, was when maybe one of the gentlemen, maybe your uncle or granduncle, he was having like a scotch or something, and he might want ice.
Yes.
Your parents and my parents and everyone else would give him 1 ice cube.
Yeah.
Because the ice was a tray. There was only 12 cubes in it anyway.
That's all in this little tray.
One cube of ice, and he was used to the glass being full of ice and half full of whiskey.
Yeah, and you see, this was all very well and good, John, and there was the duty-free whiskey as well, which was mighty. But the thing is, there might be a little bit of carpet got for stairs or for a sitting room or a rug and that, and which was all very well. But on some ways, I remember my mother a little bit put out by all of this, because while they meant well and they were doing, there might be the implication that, things were a bit primitive at home and could be improved. And there was a small tension between things. And if you look at it, which we do explore a little bit in the show, a small bit, you see there's a desperate dilemma for the immigrant, because they needed to get away, for jobs, for work, for self-betterment, for social opportunities, for marriage, for a fuller life. But they were awful attached to home, so somebody had to stay at home to mind the place. look after the farm, maybe mind the parents. So there was this deep attachment and guilt. There was a guilt, you know.
Well, also what you're coming to there, Brian, I think, is like the Yanks that came back, maybe deep in their heart, they felt sorry for us and they had to blame somebody. So they blamed the British, of course, for the famine, for the injustice. They didn't know that. So they came back to America with a deep resentment for the British and a big support for the United Ireland, like what I'm doing myself, thinking how bad the British treated us during the Troubles and long before that.
Yeah.
And they came away thinking, so it's not your fault, Brian, that you're not too bright or too educated, that you don't have enough ice in the fridge.
Yeah.
You blame the British.
The lousy Brits, is it?
And then before the Troubles, when they came back, if there was fundraising going on for the IRA, of course, and the Yanks had the money, they loved making big donations to the IRA because they thought every $200 I donate is going to kill a British soldier, which was a negative thing to think of. But they were more Irish than the Irish themselves.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And many Irish who worked in America would have noticed whether if you had bar work or you were waitressing or you were cooking or chefing or whatever, you noticed the collections for NORAID in particular is what I had seen at the time, and the depths of the pockets and the donations. It was a little troubling because you knew that the situation was a bit more nuanced and a bit more complicated than these people. But they were again hanging on, as you say, to the sense of great injustice, which was done. Remember, there had been a famine and there had been terrible things had happened, and certainly the Irish infrastructure lagged behind the rest of Europe in some ways. So they built magnificent cities, the British. As my father used to say, looking at some of the castles, he said they might have been tyrants, but they had taste. So there was all of that kind of going on and playing in the background.
It's like if you take the town in Mayo, Westport, which was designed, and the architect was a famous British gentleman, and it's probably one of the best laid out towns in Ireland when it comes to the streets, how wide they are, no problem with parking, no problem with traffic jams, beautiful layout with the rivers and everything. And that's maybe one example. But then the other thing the Yanks had as well, they had that yearning, like the yearning to be Irish, more Irish than they were deep down. But it's not there. So I'm going to call on Jimmy Grady to sing a song, which will tie in here, I think. It was written by a young man who was on vacation in France, I think, and he got homesick for Scotland. So Caledonia is the Latin word for Scotland, but this song relates to anything.
I don't know if you can see the changes that have come over me in these last few days. I've been afraid that I might drift away. I've been telling old stories, singing songs that made me think about where I came from, and that's the reason why I seem so far away today. But let me tell you that I love you and that I think about you all the time. Caledonia, you're calling me. Now I'm going home. And if I should become a stranger, you know that it would make me more than sad. Caledonia's been everything I've ever had. Oh, I have moved and I've kept on moving, proved the points that I needed proving. I have lost the friends that I needed losing, found others on the way. I have tried and I've kept on trying, stolen dreams, yes, there's no denying. I have traveled far with my conscience flying, somewhere with the wind. But let me tell you that I love you and that I think about you all the time. Caledonia, you're calling me, and now I'm going home. The empty room, the forest fire, oh, the flames that couldn't get any higher. They've withered now, they've gone. But I am steady, thinking my way's clear, and now I know what'll do tomorrow. When the hands are shaking and the kisses flow, then I will disappear. But let me tell you that I love you, and that I think about you all the time. Caledonia, you're calling me, now I'm going home. And if I should become a stranger, you know that it would make me more than sad. Caledonia's been everything I've ever had.
A good young man. He has a very successful career in front of him. He won't be working like his 5 generations ago, like his predecessors. Thank you, John. I'm back to you, Brian, now.
Yeah.
To explain more about the tour that you did recently, and you can give me a brief synopsis of where you went on the tour in Ireland.
Yes, well, we took the tour around. We had originally been in Glore in Ennis. We took it to the new Arts Centre in Tullamore. We were in Sligo. Originally, we'd been in Dublin in the Workingmen's Club. So we've done quite a bit of touring around the place with the show. I suppose in terms of plugging my own stuff, one of the reasons we do live shows like that is usually as a professional writer, as someone who records all these stories we've been talking, it's very hard to get shelf space in bookshops and that. It's a deeply competitive space. One of the best sort of things I find to do is to get out on tour.
Oh, yeah.
So I have this book called Love These Days. This is the new novel, John, which you won't have read yet. It's only out since the end of the year. The best way to get that sometimes is to live perform, and then like the musicians, like Shamey, is to sell your merchandise really during the interval and after the show. And you move quite a bit of books, and it spreads a good word and a good feeling, a good buzz. And that book, Love These Days, represented a change for me because I started writing about where I live on the coast of Sligo and that modern environment and that time. Influenced also as it was, it's set in 2016, which of course was the date of the Brexit referendum. What we were talking about earlier, what the old bother that seemed so thoroughly and comprehensively found a negotiated solution that kept both sides happy. All of a sudden, there was this kind of a spanner thrown in the works called Brexit, which threatened to reintroduce the border and all of that. So we had a moment there, which seems to be slightly diffused again, but that tension is always with us.
Thanks to the Yanks for being a big part of the Good Friday Agreement, and indeed Senator George Mitchell warned London at the time of the Brexit, and he told them not to mess with the Good Friday Agreement.
Yes.
You can leave Europe if you want to leave Europe, but leave the Good Friday Agreement intact as it was fought for debate-wise, politically-wise, long and hard by everybody, from Ian Paisley to Martin McGuinness and ministers down the south. And it went on for years to formulate it properly. And that's why I'm still shouting for the United Ireland come 2030, because we will be entitled to get the 6 counties back. And I'm sure the people in the 6 counties will be glad to join us because we're part of Europe and we're big stars now. Maybe we were little boys once, but now we're big men, okay?
Yes, I think, John, there's been a very distinct shift there. I mean, the great achievement of George Mitchell and the negotiators was that all sides in the Good Friday Agreement felt that they had gained more than they had lost, or at least the other side had not gained something that to their advantage beyond what the other side had gained. That was the art of diplomacy at its, since then, yes, I have seen, and even friends of mine who would have taken a fairly level-headed, neutral-ish stance had said, well, we never envisaged being part of a Northern Ireland that was not part of Europe. And that has really pulled things in the direction of unification to a further extent. Remember, though, that we were talking about immigrants and having a territorial claim, if not physically, then in your heart and in your mind, at the deep heart's core, you feel that there's a territorial claim. But that we did have our referenda to say that, we will not exercise an actual territorial claim on the place. That is a matter of consensus, and for there to be the will of the people through voting. What will become of that, I don't know. I find that politics, anything to do with Northern Ireland, is like a very, very thick cable with a very high electric energy going through it. And you can bend it this way and shape it to your liking and do that. But the minute you start to saw or cut into it, you can get an awful shock and a jolt.
Well, that's a good analogy. And coming back to something you just said a moment ago, it's like a person that feels that they've lost, like we call the loser, they need to be given a bone to chew on. If you take the American situation here with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, now, if it's just an analogy as well, like if I don't know who's going to win this, I do in my mind, but I wouldn't say, if Kamala Harris is to win and be the next president of America, it would be very nice for her to pardon Donald Trump for all his misgivings, sleeping with Stormy Daniels, everything. And if you think about it, it's an easy one for her to pardon. Like it's like a silly boy sleeping with a prostitute and a silly boy putting his storage files into his bathroom and other nonsense. So it's like she should say, I forgive you, and I am the president of America. I look at your situation. You fought a good battle. Assuming he loses, he may win.
You never know. I think it's going to be a close thing.
It'll be a close thing, but I won't dwell on it any longer. But I think it will be nice.
John, I suppose you bring us back to where we started in some ways. There was a funny headline in one of the jokey papers after the Trump court cases where it said Irish hotelier found guilty. And of course, Donald Trump is an Irish hotelier at some degree. And that fascination, that connection we talked about between, that business is doing extremely well. There's a deep curiosity to partake, even where the politics mightn't be divided into red or blue or green or orange, there is an odd echo of that old nostalgia we were talking about the glamour and strangeness of the American, the Yank, and their presence in Ireland, and the sense of, what is it, largesse or bigness or scale that they bring in comparison to us.
Well, if you want to bring it in, like say, into genealogy, like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris has more in common than they actually realize. She has Scottish roots, and he is obviously Scottish. So when it came out, she's a Protestant from the north of Ireland. No, her ancestors originally came from Scotland. He has roots in Scotland, so they're more Scottish than we are, I guess.
Yeah. And John, I suppose you bring me to the final thing I was thinking of when we began our conversation today, because another thing that was on my mind is that the Irish-American connection. And as you say, there's merely possibly a stronger Caledonian-American connection between their ancestry. And what I'm very conscious of now is my mother and my grandmother. It was their brothers and sisters that were directly migrated and immigrated to America. So when they came back, they were welcoming home and embracing brothers and sisters. Now it's the cousins. And the cousins, like my generation, are getting that bit older too. So there's the nieces and nephews. Each of those to me is, while especially the cousins who remember, as you say, coming home and doing the hay saving, and it wasn't work to them, like Tom Sawyer whistling, painting the fence, It seems like fun, so it is fun. So they have very fond nostalgic memories, but I feel that the connection is getting a little thinner and thinner with each generation. And of course that's natural, because the blood relationship between brother and sister is not the same between cousins and then to nieces. So I love that it's keeping up. I see it in a period of changing again.
Well, here in New York, there's a revival of the Gaelic Irish language. And I have a gentleman on here, his name is Dahi, and we spoke bilingual for a whole half hour more. And he's out in a place called Tív na Gréine, which is Sunnyside, and there's also Tív na Culture, which is Woodside. And he has Irish classes every week for beginners and in between, whatever. So it's nice to see the interest in it for the next generation coming down, keeping a little
Yes.
bit of the Irish that they have.
Well, you talked about if Britain had one thing, an ambition way back, it was colonization. The best way you can achieve it is to kill the language, and when you kill the language, you kill the stories and you kill the folk memory and the history. So, of course, that dilution from the native Irish tongue to Irish represented a kind of a threat to the identity. And it is, as you say, fascinating how it has percolated back up as if out of the land itself. And it is becoming a thing where you're in a world full of multiple identities where we find a stable centre is getting increasingly difficult. The language becomes a marker and a North Star to navigate yourself back to that kind of cross that Emerald Sea, back to that heartland.
I came across a book a few weeks ago, and my friend that passed away, Pat Linney, was a famous Irish poet from Rossport, and he had perfect English, but his Gaelic, his Irish language, was so perfect and smooth. He was a good friend of Caroline Murphy, and he actually helped me one time write a thesis on a town called Killala. And he made the phrase, I walked to every town in Ireland and I ran through Killala, giving Killala kind of a smaller identity. But he also did say, Gontier, Gonchanga, if you don't have your language, you don't have your country. And Pat Linney was a good friend and a good historian and a good poet, needless to say. So it's nice to keep those tidbits of little, even if it's only a little bit of Irish. And I always end my podcast in Irish.
Yes, and I suppose if we talked about NARAID and supporting your country and all that, it's probably where the support needs to go now is into the cultural endeavours that fortify through the language and through the story and through all of that. That's where our future resides, in that kind of clarity of who we are and what our story is.
Well, it's good to have your own identity. There's big festivals here for every country at different times. Like the St. Paddy's Day Parade is the big one, of course, and it's celebrated, and everyone wants to be somewhat Irish and wear the green and drink the beer and whatever and celebrate the day. Just the whole identity of us. And I think we sometimes underestimate it for ourselves, Like, say, I like your accent, and I don't even know I have an accent,
Yes, our grandfathers used to listen to the radio, and they'd have thick Mayo and Roscommon and Leitrim accents, and say, God, the fellow on the radio has a fierce accent, not realising they have fun themselves. Well, John, it's been lovely chatting to you.
I'm looking forward to getting that last book that you have. I didn't get it yet. I have the others actually.
Love these days. It's on the Lepus print website, hopefully.
Okay, I will look it up, and you can put up the title for me as well.
I can indeed.
Yeah. So I'm going to sign out in my Irish language, of course, and I'm going to say Shin Scale, which means that's the story. Beis Scale means we'll have another story. Slán means goodbye, of course.
Slán, John, slán.